Four men, heavy steel chains, a dead stretch of desert road where even the wind sounded guilty. The kind of sight most people would turn away from. The kind of moment that makes grown men lock their car doors, press the gas pedal, and pretend they never saw a thing. But on that burning afternoon, a 19-year-old African mechanic with grease still under his nails, dust on his shoes, and barely $11 in his pocket, stopped walking, stared at four bleeding strangers bound to a rusted cattle post, and made a choice that should have ruined his life. Instead, it changed thousands of others. Because 3 days later, the sound that rolled down his street was so loud, so heavy, and so impossible that neighbors stepped onto porches thinking a storm was coming. It wasn't a storm. It was 3,000 riders. And every single one of them had come for the same boy who, just 72 hours earlier, was too broke to fix the leak in his own roof. His name was Kofi Mensah. Most people in Red Mesa, Arizona knew him as the quiet African kid from Building C who walked fast, worked hard, and never seemed to sleep. He was the one with the oil-stained shirt and the polite voice. The one who always said yes when somebody needed help moving a couch, jump-starting a dead car, or carrying groceries upstairs for an old neighbor with bad knees. What most people didn't know was that Kofi's life ran on a kind of pressure that breaks a lot of young men before they ever get the chance to become one. He lived with his mother, Amma, and his 12-year-old sister, Suri, in a tired two-bedroom apartment at the edge of town where the desert started to swallow the pavement. The place had cracked blinds, a humming refrigerator that sounded like it was praying for mercy, and a brown water stain on the ceiling that had slowly spread over the kitchen like a warning nobody could afford to answer. Amma worked nights cleaning offices 40 minutes away. Some weeks, she came home so tired she fell asleep sitting up, still wearing her work shoes. Suri was bright, funny, always drawing in the margins of her school notebooks, but she had learned early not to ask for much. And Kofi had turned 19 just 4 months earlier and had already become the kind of son who notices which bill is due before his mother even opens the envelope. He worked at Mendoza Auto Repair 6 days a week, sometimes 7. Not because the pay was good. It wasn't. But because Mr. Mendoza let him stay late and learn. Kofi could already tell what was wrong with an engine by the way it coughed on startup. He could patch hoses, change belts, weld brackets, and bring dead machines back to life with the kind of patience you only learn when nobody's coming to rescue your own family. He had a dream, too. A quiet one. He wanted to study emergency medicine. Not because it sounded impressive. Because when he was 14, his father collapsed in a market parking lot 2 towns over, and everybody stood there, waiting for somebody else to act. By the time the ambulance arrived, it was too late. Kofi never forgot how helpless that felt. He had made himself a promise that day. One day, when people froze, he wouldn't. But promises are easy to make when you're a boy. They become expensive when you're a man. That Thursday had started like most hard days start, with too little sleep and too much weight already waiting on the other side of sunrise. At 6:10 that morning, Kofi was under the hood of a delivery van before he had even finished the tea his mother poured into a cracked travel mug. By noon, he had changed 2 brake systems, patched a radiator line, and skipped lunch because Mr. Mendoza had taken a call from a customer who couldn't pay in full unless the car was ready that day. By 3, the Arizona heat had turned the shop into a metal oven, and everybody was moving slower except Kofi. He kept moving because stopping meant thinking. And thinking meant remembering that the landlord had taped a bright orange notice to their apartment door the night before. Past due, 72 hours to pay or vacate. The number at the bottom of that page felt impossible. $940. To some people, that's an inconvenience. To Kofi, it was a wall. Mr. Mendoza noticed he was quiet near the end of the shift. "Everything okay, kid?" Kofi forced the kind of smile poor people become experts at. "Yeah, just tired." Mr. Mendoza nodded like he knew better, but didn't push. "Take the shortcut home. Sun's dropping hard today." Kofi wiped his hands, grabbed his backpack, and stepped out into the late afternoon heat. The shortcut Mr. Mendoza meant was County Route 8, an older stretch of road that cut behind abandoned ranch land and shaved 20 minutes off the walk back toward Red Mesa. Most people avoided it, not because it was dangerous in the usual way. There just wasn't much out there. A lonely road, dry brush, faded fencing, the skeletons of old signs. The kind of emptiness that makes your footsteps sound too loud. Kofi took it anyway. Thought leaving us here would send a message. To who? The man managed a bitter half-laugh. "Wish I knew." Kofi pulled at the chain. Solid, too thick to break barehanded. The locks were commercial grade. He looked around fast. No tools. No loose metal heavy enough for leverage. No nearby building except what looked like the collapsed remains of an old utility shed 50 yards away. "I need something to cut with," he said. The man with the shallow breathing suddenly jerked against the restraints. "Water." Kofi unzipped his backpack, pulled out the half bottle he'd been saving for the walk home, and lifted it to the man's mouth. Not too much, just enough to whet the panic. He tore a clean rag from an old t-shirt he kept in the bag and pressed it into the split eyebrow of the youngest biker among them. Then he stood. "I'm coming back." The oldest man grabbed his wrist as far as the chain allowed. "Kid, if you leave..." Kofi looked him right in the eye. "I said, I'm coming back." He ran to the utility shed. The roof had collapsed years ago, and half of it had been eaten by rust. But junk has a way of surviving where people don't. Inside, under broken boards and a bent screen frame, Kofi found a length of pipe, a rusted pry bar, and hanging from one nail by a miracle that felt almost deliberate, a pair of old bolt cutters. One handle was cracked. The jaws were orange with rust. But metal doesn't care how beautiful the tool is if you know how to use it. Kofi ran back, lungs burning, dust kicking behind him. The gray-haired biker saw the cutters and let out a breath that sounded halfway between pain and disbelief. "Where in God's name did you find those?" "In a place that forgot it still had them," Kofi said. He dropped to one knee and set the jaws against the first chain. Nothing. He adjusted, pressed harder. The cracked handle bit into his palm. Still nothing. The chain was thicker than it looked, and the cutters were fighting him. Sweat ran into his eyes. The sun pressed down. The man with the damaged breathing started slipping again. "Try the side link," one biker whispered. "Not the center, the side." Kofi shifted the angle, planted one foot into the dirt, both hands on the handles, and drove his full weight downward. The metal groaned, then snapped. The sound was so sudden every man there flinched. One wrist free, 3 more to go. "Easy," Kofi said, voice steady even though his arms were already shaking. "One at a time." The first biker stumbled the moment he was loose. Kofi caught him under the shoulder and helped ease him down. The second lock took longer. The rusted cutter slipped twice, and nearly broke Kofi's thumb. The third chain had twisted around the post in such a way that he had to use the pipe as leverage while pinning the cutter with his knee. At one point he stopped, pressed his forehead to his wrist, and breathed, because black spots had started crowding the edge of his vision. The gray-haired man saw it. "Leave us and run to the highway," he rasped. "If they come back, you die with us." Kofi didn't even look up. "If they come back," he said, "then at least you won't still be chained." It was such a simple sentence, so plain, so stripped of performance. And maybe that's why the men never forgot it. By the time the second biker was free, the one with the rapid breathing had started fading again. Kofi dropped the cutters, loosened the man's jacket, tilted his chin up, and got him to follow his voice. "Look at me. Stay here. Stay with me. You're not done yet." The biker blinked hard, eyes wet with fear and heat. "What's your name?" "Kofi." "Kofi," the man whispered, like he needed the name in case this was the last thing he ever knew. The third chain finally gave after Kofi repositioned the jaws and used the pipe to extend the broken handle. He nearly fell backward when it snapped. The oldest biker, once loose, slumped against the post and shut his eyes in pain. Kofi checked his ribs as gently as he could. "Can you stand?" "For a funeral, maybe." "Good. This isn't that." Even bleeding, the man laughed. The last lock was the worst. It had been doubled through the barrier frame, then tensioned tight. Kofi worked at it so long his forearms started cramping. His shirt stuck to his back. His fingers lost strength. More than once he glanced toward the road, half expecting engines, boots, gunfire, anything. Nothing came. Only heat, only silence, only that chain. The gray-haired man watched him for nearly a minute before saying, "Son, why did you stop?" Kofi kept working. "Because you needed me." "No," the man said, studying him like the answer mattered. "Why did you really stop?" That time Kofi paused. Not long, just enough for a memory to pass through him. His father on hot pavement. A ring of people doing nothing. Someone saying help was coming. Help coming too late. He set the cutters again. "Because once," he said quietly, "someone I loved needed one person to act. Nobody did." Then he drove the handles down with everything he had left. The final lock broke. For a second, nobody spoke. 4 grown men, who looked like they had been built from road dust, leather, and bad decisions, stood unsteady in front of a 19-year-old kid with torn palms and shaking hands. The gray-haired one straightened as much as he could and offered his arm first. Kofi ignored it. Not out of disrespect. He just saw the danger first. "Can any of you walk?" "Somehow," the man said. "Then we move now. Highway's too far if someone collapses. There's a service station 1.5 miles south. If I help one of you, can the rest support each other?" The man nodded. "Name's Mason." Kofi gave the smallest nod back. "Okay, Mason. You take the older one on your left. Beard takes him on the right. The one who can barely breathe stays with me." Mason looked at him with the kind of astonishment older men feel when a kid becomes the adult in the room without asking permission. "Were you military?" Mason asked. Kofi shook his head. "No, just paying attention." They started walking, if you can call it that. It was more a slow collapse in the direction of survival. The bikers limped and staggered. Twice, Kofi had to stop the man leaning on him from dropping entirely. Once he heard a vehicle far off and froze everybody in the brush until it passed. Every second felt borrowed. When they finally reached the old station, it was closed. Boarded window, faded sign, dead payphone. For a moment, the kind of hopelessness that ruins people almost got through. Then Kofi saw the owner's side gate hanging loose. He eased one of the men onto an upside-down crate, circled the building, and found an older woman locking up a back storage room. She saw the blood before she saw him. Within 2 minutes, 911 had been called. Within 5, county deputies were racing in. Within 10, paramedics were cutting away sleeves, checking pupils, lifting the injured onto stretchers, and asking the same question over and over. Who found them? The first biker pointed at Kofi. The second repeated his name. The third tried to speak, but only managed tears. Mason, half inside an ambulance already, reached out and caught Kofi's wrist again. This time, his grip was weak, but his eyes weren't. Where do you live? Kofi looked at the blood on his own hands and stepped back. You don't need that. Mason's expression changed just slightly, like a man making a note he had no intention of losing. What's your full name, son? Kofi Mensah. One of the deputies turned. You need to stay and give a statement. Kofi glanced toward the road to Red Mesa, then toward the clock above the station garage. 6:42 p.m. His mother's bus got back at 7:30. Suri hated eating alone. The rent notice was still on the door. The world had no idea it had just become dramatic. Bills were still bills. I can't stay long, Kofi said. The deputy frowned. You were at a violent crime scene. And my family is waiting on dinner. People say lines like that in movies, and they sound noble. In real life, they usually sound like truth. He gave the shortest version of what happened, left his number, then walked home with dried blood on his sleeve and a split blister across his palm where the broken cutter handle had bitten deep. By the time he reached Building C, the hallway smelled like fried onions and old carpet. Suri was at the table doing math homework under the flickering light. Amma was just out of the shower, tying a scarf over damp hair, trying to hide the exhaustion in her shoulders. You're late, she said, then saw his hands. Kofi. He shrugged like rescuing 4 chained strangers was the kind of thing that just happens between shifts. Long day. She took 1 step closer and stopped. That is not grease. Suri looked up. What did you do? Kofi set his bag down slowly. Something I hope never needs doing again. They sat. He told them enough to explain the blood, but not enough to make his mother lose sleep imagining what could have happened if the attackers came back. Amma listened in silence, both hands wrapped around a chipped mug. When he finished, she didn't speak for a few seconds. Then she said, Your father would have done the same. Kofi looked away. That was all. No violins, no speeches, no miracle. They ate rice and stewed beans under a leaking ceiling with an eviction notice still taped outside their door. Meanwhile, 50 miles away, in a private trauma unit at St. Joseph's Regional, men in expensive suits were discovering that the 4 bikers found on County Route 8 were not ordinary victims. The gray-haired man who had asked Kofi why he stopped was Mason Rourke. To the police,
he was a victim of aggravated assault and robbery. To the business world, he was a logistics magnate worth more than most small towns. But to thousands of people across the Southwest, Mason was known for something else. He was the founder of the Road Shepherds. Officially, the Road Shepherds were a motorcycle brotherhood turned emergency relief network. They delivered generators after blackouts, supplies after wildfires, and muscle when forgotten communities needed rebuilding fast. Veterans, mechanics, medics, welders, truckers, former firefighters, carpenters, people who liked action more than speeches. Unofficially, they were the kind of force that made predators reconsider entire business models.
And somebody had just tried to leave their founder chained in the desert to die. By midnight, half a dozen phones were ringing in rooms powerful men assume are private. By 2 a.m., Mason had heard enough from investigators to understand two things clearly. First, the attack had been deliberate. Second, the only reason he and his 3 men were alive was because a 19-year-old kid with no backup refused to walk away. At 7:15 the next morning, despite 3 cracked ribs and strict orders to rest, Mason was sitting upright in a hospital bed with a legal pad on his lap. He wrote one name at the top: Kofi Mensah. Then he looked at the men gathered around him and said, "Find out who he is before the day ends." One of them nodded. "Police have his statement." "Not enough," Mason said. "I want to know how a kid that young stays calm in a killing field. I want to know what kind of house he went back to. I want to know who raised him. And I want to know what kind of trouble follows a boy who helps strangers like that." It turned out the trouble was easy to find. By noon, they knew Kofi worked at Mendoza Auto. By 2, they knew his mother was behind on rent. By 3, they knew Suri's school had flagged her as gifted but undersupported. By 4, they knew Amma had been taking double shifts while hiding the fact that her blood pressure medication had run out 2 weeks earlier because every extra dollar was going toward rent. And by sunset, they knew something uglier. The apartment complex where Kofi lived had quietly been targeted by a holding company buying up low-income property across Red Mesa. Repairs were ignored. Tenants were pressured out. Late fees multiplied. Utilities were accidentally interrupted. Buildings were allowed to decay until people got desperate enough to leave. Then the land got repackaged and sold for redevelopment. Families like Kofi's weren't just poor, they were being squeezed. When Mason heard that, something in his face changed. Not anger first, decision. He asked for his phone. The man nearest him handed it over. Mason opened the Road Shepherds emergency channel and recorded a message. He did not shout. Power rarely needs volume. 72 hours ago, 4 of us were left chained to die off County Route 8. A 19-year-old kid named Kofi Mensah stopped and saved our lives. Today I learned that while he was busy being braver than most men twice his age, his family was being buried under rent pressure, neglect, and a system that hopes quiet people disappear. Saturday morning, we show Red Mesa what happens when the forgotten save the wrong strangers. Riders, builders, medics, legal team, supply trucks, roll out. Full colors, full respect. We do this clean. We do this lawful. We do this loud enough that nobody ever tries to erase that family again. He hit send. By nightfall, the message had spread across Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Texas, and beyond. The replies came in faster than they could be logged. "I'm in. 2 trucks from Flagstaff. Generator trailer available. Bringing roofing crew. Mobile clinic ready. 40 riders from Tucson. 90 from Albuquerque. Scholarship committee contact secured. Legal aid confirmed. Food convoy loaded. By dawn Friday, Red Mesa was still just Red Mesa. Dusty, underfunded, easy to overlook. Kofi went to work like normal. He didn't know that men in 6 states were changing routes, packing tools, fueling bikes, and calling old favors because of one decision he made on a dead road. At the shop, Mr. Mendoza waved him toward Bay 3. "You're famous." Kofi frowned. "No, I'm late." Mr. Mendoza pointed at the small television mounted near the parts counter. A local news segment was running. Desert Survivor Kid rescues 4 attacked riders. The anchor didn't know much yet. No dramatic music, no national headlines. Just shaky phone footage from outside St. Joseph's and a deputy saying the victims would likely not have survived much longer in that heat. Mr. Mendoza folded his arms. "That you?" Kofi didn't answer right away, because seeing your own life on a screen always feels like watching somebody else's emergency. Finally, he said, "I was there." Mr. Mendoza studied him for a second, then reached into the register drawer and pushed a folded envelope across the counter. "What's this?" "Advance on next week." "I can't take that." "You can if your landlord can." Mr. Mendoza shrugged. "Don't argue with kindness. It makes it slower." Kofi took the envelope, throat tightening. That night, Amma cried for the first time in front of him in months. Not because the money solved everything, because it meant they had one more day. Saturday came hot and pale. At 6:04 a.m., Kofi woke to a sound he couldn't place. Low at first, like distant thunder, then layered, then growing. He sat up. The windows trembled faintly. Suri appeared in the doorway, hair wild, eyes wide. "Do you hear that?" He was already pulling on jeans. Outside, porch lights flicked on all across the complex. A dog started barking. Someone yelled from the next building. Amma stepped onto the balcony and went still. The sound was no longer distant. It was engines. Hundreds of them. No. More. The first line of motorcycles rolled into the entrance road just as the sun broke over the low hills. Chrome flashed. Headlights cut through dust. Leather vests, utility trucks, flatbeds, vans, pickup convoys, one after another. Then another. Then another. The entire street filled with motion until it looked less like traffic and more like a living river made of steel and purpose. Neighbors came out in slippers, robes, work boots, school uniforms, whatever they had on. Phones were lifted, mouths hung open. Children ran to fences. And right in front of Building C, at the head of that impossible column, a black touring bike came to a stop. Mason Rourke swung one leg off, slower than usual because of the ribs, but upright all the same. Kofi froze. He knew that face. The cut on the jaw had been stitched. The eyes were the same. Mason removed his gloves and looked up at the second-floor balcony where Kofi stood with his mother and sister. Then he said, loud enough for the whole complex to hear, "Kofi Mensah! I asked you where you lived. You told me I didn't need to know. Turns out I did." A ripple of laughter broke the tension. Kofi came downstairs slowly, almost like he was afraid the scene would disappear if he moved too fast. When he reached the bottom step, Mason held out his hand. This time, Kofi took it. The grip was firm, real. "You shouldn't be out of the hospital," Kofi said. Mason smiled. "You shouldn't be paying rent before 20 and saving full-grown men in the desert. But here we are." The crowd laughed again, softer this time. Mason turned, gesturing with one arm to the endless line behind him. 3 days ago, 4 of us were written off, stripped, chained, and left in the heat because some men figured nobody would stop for people who looked hard to love. They were wrong. You stopped. You stayed. You bled. You fought metal with broken tools. And then you went home to make dinner for your family like saving lives was just another errand. A murmur moved through the riders. Mason's voice dropped, but somehow got stronger. "I've spent a long time around men who talk big about loyalty, courage, brotherhood, honor. Then I met a 19-year-old kid with none of our patches, none of our resources, none of our backup. And he showed all of us what those words look like when nobody's watching." He stepped aside. That's when the work began. And it happened so fast the whole morning felt unreal. A roofing crew moved on the building with ladders and bundled shingles before 9 o'clock. Electricians started checking dead outlets in 3 apartments, not just Kofi's. Plumbers unloaded pipe, fittings, and 2 replacement water heaters from a supply truck no one in management had authorized. But nobody was foolish enough to block. A mobile medical van parked near the mailboxes and began offering free blood pressure checks, medication consultations, and basic treatment to residents who had been going without care for months. At the picnic area, another team set up grills, coolers, folding tables, and enough food to feed half the zip code. Kids who had never seen anything bigger than a school fundraiser stood in a line receiving backpacks, notebooks, shoes, and boxed lunches from leather-vested bikers who looked like they belonged in a prison movie and smiled like grandfathers. A legal aid trailer opened beside the office. By lunchtime, tenants were filing complaints, documenting neglect, and reviewing lease violations with 2 attorneys and a retired housing inspector who had shown up from Phoenix because he heard what happened to the boy who saved Mason Rourke. Amma stood near the stairwell, holding Suri's hand so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. "What is all this?" she whispered. Mason answered before Kofi could. "Respect. Overdue." Then came the part Kofi wasn't prepared for. A woman in a navy blazer stepped out of a white pickup with the logo of Southwest Community College on the door. Beside her was Mr. Mendoza, looking smug in the way only kind men look smug. The woman smiled at Kofi. "You filed for the emergency medical technician bridge program last spring, correct?" Kofi blinked. "Yes, but I deferred. I couldn't." She held up a folder. "You can now. Full scholarship. Tuition, books, clinical gear, transportation stipend. Private donors requested discretion, but after what I've seen this morning, I doubt secrecy survives the day." Kofi stared at the folder like it was written in another language. Mason leaned closer. "Open it." His hands shook as he did. There it was. His name. His acceptance. Paid in full. Suri screamed before he said a word. Amma covered her mouth and cried openly. Mr. Mendoza looked away at the sky, pretending desert sunlight had suddenly become emotional. But the day still wasn't finished. At around 1 in the afternoon, a flatbed truck rolled in, carrying something draped beneath a gray tarp. The riders parted as it parked. Mason nodded toward it. "Go on." Kofi stepped forward slowly. 2 men pulled the tarp back. Underneath sat a fully restored service truck. Older model, fresh paint, fitted cabinets, compressor, tools, diagnostic kit, jack stands, portable welder, the works. On both doors, in clean black lettering, were the words, Mensah Mobile Mechanics. Kofi looked back so fast he almost lost balance. I can't take this. Yes, you can, Mason said, because it's not charity. It's investment. Another man stepped forward with a clipboard. Business license fees covered for the first year. Insurance handled. Basic accounting support, too. You've already got the hands. We're just removing the excuses poverty likes to use. Kofi laughed once, helplessly, because some kinds of grace arrive so large they break your ability to act normal. He walked around the truck slowly, touching the fender, the tool drawers, the tires, the side mirror, like he needed his fingertips to confirm it existed. Then he stopped. There are other families here, he said, looking at the buildings around him. Other kids. Mason smiled like he had hoped that would be the first thing out of his mouth. I know. He pointed toward the far end of the lot, where a banner was being lifted between two poles. Red Mesa Community Repair Weekend. We came for you, Mason said. We stay for them. That was the moment the complex changed from a surprise into a movement. By mid-afternoon, 3 apartment roofs had active crews on them. Donations were being logged, not tossed around. Volunteer teachers had set up a table for kids with books and school supplies. The food line turned into a neighborhood meal. Strangers introduced themselves to neighbors they had lived beside for years without really meeting. People who had learned to keep their heads down started standing straighter. And in the middle of all that noise, Kofi saw something that hit him harder than the truck, the scholarship, or the crowd. His mother was laughing. Not the small, careful laugh she used when pretending bills weren't frightening. A real one. Head back, eyes bright. For the first time in a long time, she looked less like someone surviving life and more like someone allowed to live it. Late in the day, once the sun softened and the crowd spread out into work teams and food circles, Mason found Kofi sitting on the curb beside the new truck, staring at everything like his mind still hadn't caught up. Mason lowered himself carefully beside him. Hurts to sit, he admitted. You should still be in bed, Kofi said, and you should have kept walking that road. Mason glanced at him, but neither of us did the smart thing. For a few seconds they watched 2 little boys trying on oversized biker sunglasses near the grill tables. Then Kofi asked the question that had been sitting in his chest since the convoy arrived. Why this much? Mason was quiet. When he spoke, the swagger was gone. Because 21 years ago, my daughter was in a wreck on Highway 60. Car flipped. Smoke. Glass. People slowed down. Some stared. One woman stopped. School teacher. Tiny thing. Pulled my girl halfway out before the fire crew got there. Burned her own arm doing it. Never asked for a reward. Never gave her full name. Just left. He swallowed once. My daughter lived 6 more years because of that woman. 6 years I wouldn't have had. Kofi turned to him fully. Mason looked out over the complex. When I was chained to that post and saw you coming through the brush, I didn't think help. I thought witness. But you stayed. And all I could think later was this. If a stranger could give me 6 more years with my child back then, The least I can do now is make sure the boy who saved me gets the life he almost got priced out of." Kofi said nothing. Some stories demand silence more than reply. Mason reached into his vest pocket and handed him a small metal object. It was a key. Not to the truck. Another one. "What's this?" "Tool cabinet lock. Passenger side. Open it later." That night, after the last of the public speeches, after the meal trays were cleared and the lights from the work trucks painted long shadows across the lot, Kofi opened the cabinet. Inside, wrapped in a clean shop rag, was an old pair of bolt cutters. The same ones. Restored, cleaned, mounted with a small brass plate that read, "When everybody else passed, you stopped." Kofi closed the cabinet and stood there for a long time with one hand on the door. By Sunday evening, the leak over the kitchen was gone. The broken stair rail near Building B had been reinforced. 3 families had received legal representation. Amma had 6 months of medication covered. Suri had a mentor lined up through a youth arts nonprofit one of the riders supported. And the management company that had spent months squeezing tenants suddenly discovered a deep respect for maintenance schedules under public scrutiny. News crews came. Politicians hovered. Social media did what it does. But the part nobody could manufacture was the feeling left behind once the engines finally faded. Red Mesa had seen what solidarity looked like in motion. And Kofi had learned something too. Sometimes the world changes because powerful people decide to care. But sometimes it changes because one exhausted kid on one hot road refuses to let fear outsource his conscience. A month later, Kofi started classes. He still worked, still fixed cars, still came home tired. But now there was direction in the exhaustion. The truck was real. The scholarship was real. The community repair weekend became a monthly program. Mr. Mendoza claimed half the customers preferred the mobile service because the kid listens to engines better than most men listen to their wives. Amma kept the orange eviction notice folded in a drawer, not as trauma, but as evidence of where they almost broke and didn't. Suri hung a photo of the convoy above her desk and told anyone who asked that her brother accidentally started a motorcycle army. And maybe that was the best part of all. Kofi never became arrogant. He never acted like he was owed applause. When reporters asked him what made him stop that day, he gave different versions of the same truth. Because they were human. Because I was there. Because leaving would have followed me home. That last answer spread the farthest. Because everybody knows what it feels like to leave something wrong behind and still feel it waiting in the room with you later. Years from now, people in Red Mesa will probably forget the exact number of bikes that came down that road. Some will say 2,000, some 3, some more. That's how memory works when it collides with wonder. But they will remember the sound. They will remember the dust. They will remember a poor African teenager standing in the middle of a parking lot, blinking into the sunrise, while a city's worth of strangers showed up to say the kindest thing society ever says to someone who has carried too much alone. We see you now. And if you ask Mason Rourke what saved his life that day out on County Route 8, he'll tell you it wasn't the ambulance. It wasn't the police. It wasn't even the broken bolt cutters. It was a decision. A simple, dangerous, expensive decision made by a boy who had every reason to protect only himself and did not. Because real courage is not loud when it starts. It doesn't arrive with cameras. It doesn't wait for permission. It looks like one person stopping when stopping is inconvenient. One person kneeling when everybody else keeps driving. One person choosing to get involved without any guarantee the story ends well for them. And maybe that's why this story matters. Not because 3,000 riders came. That was the echo. The real story happened in the silence before that. On a dead road, in dangerous heat. At the exact moment Kofi could have walked away and nobody would have blamed him. He just didn't. So if this story hit you somewhere real, if it reminded you that decency still has muscle and courage still wears ordinary clothes, then do two things for me. First, share this video with someone who still believes one person can't make a difference. And second, when life puts something broken in front of you this week, don't be the car that keeps moving. Be the one that stops. Like, subscribe, and come back for the next story, because the world is still full of quiet people doing unforgettable things.